All right, what's going on, everyone? First off, I hope everyone had a wonderful Christmas. And you don't celebrate Christmas, hope you had a nice weekend. I was freezing cold here, -1 Fahrenheit on like the 23rd, which is way colder than we normally get in Middle Tennessee. So my biggest concern was the bees. We've got or had two beehives around the house, amateur beekeepers, kind of figuring this out as we go. But we lost one of the hives a couple weeks ago. They just left because bees do that sometimes. So we're down to one colony, and this was such a severe drop in the temperature that I'm a little nervous that they made it through. So I'm waiting for it to warm up, then I'll get out there and check on them, but I'm nervous. Hopefully they're doing all right. On to the topic today, though. I feel like there's two different directions content can go when we're talking about current events like the war in Ukraine. We can stick with what has happened or speculate on what we might think could happen in the future. I am so much more comfortable talking about what has happened, but today I'm going to take a swing at guessing where this could go in the future around one specific topic: NATO entering the war. This is 100% personal opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's something I've been thinking more and more about recently. What would it take for NATO to get pulled into this conflict? And I thought it was worth throwing out here just for general debate. We'll walk through two scenarios that I think could lead to escalation and why I don't think a nuclear attack in Ukraine is one of those. For starters, I do not want NATO drawn into this conflict. That's just more escalation. I want it to end. No more killing, no more death. Unfortunately, as of right now, it doesn't seem like there's much room for negotiation between the two parties, but we'll see. When it comes to direct involvement from NATO, I'm making the assumption that it'll be more of a trickle than a waterfall. I think the historic idea is that either Russia or NATO attack one another, and then before we can even blink, it's an all-out war. Maybe this is just me being optimistic, but I think both sides recognize what that could mean and are more likely to slowly drift into a broader war than dive in headfirst with everything they've got. Also worth mentioning Article 5 of the NATO Charter. Quick summary here. Quote, "The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense, will assist the party so attacked by taking such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area." Technically, invoking Article 5 isn't an all-or-nothing situation. In a hypothetical event of a Russian attack, it's entirely possible that some NATO countries don't have the domestic support to kick off military action of their own, and maybe others would prefer things like economic sanctions or cyber attacks in lieu of bombing runs against Russian installations. It's very, very situationally dependent. I'm simply bringing this up to show that an attack on NATO doesn't automatically translate to World War III. There are human decisions that still have to be made to get us there. Okay, scenario one is a Russian conventional strike on Poland. The vast majority of Western aid flowing into Ukraine is coming through Poland, and I gotta imagine that shutting that off in some way has to be a goal of Russia's. The support from NATO doesn't appear to be lessening, and in some cases is even ramping up, with the U.S. sending Patriot air defense systems and considering GPS-guided bombs. Ukraine cannot continue this level of fighting without Western aid, and if that door closes, Russia will likely have a substantially easier time accomplishing their military objectives. So overall, it's very easy to see why shutting off that supply route would be incredibly important to Russia. I know this statement will probably upset some, but there are valid military targets inside of Poland from a Russian perspective. They're risky targets, that's for sure, but it's hard to tell a country at war that they can't strike the production or storage facilities of their adversary, no matter where they are. The question then is, what would the fallout be from that strike? Of course, the concern is that Poland is a NATO country, so any attack risks a response from the entirety of that military alliance. But imagine the debate that follows a Russian strike inside of Poland if nobody is killed and the location is a warehouse or a key transit point for munitions into Ukraine. Personal opinion here, I think there is enough domestic support here in the United States to continue aid shipments to Ukraine for quite a while, but I have no idea how the American public would feel about putting troops on the ground because of a Russian attack in Poland. At the very least, I don't think the response would be immediate, and I have to imagine there would be a fair amount of pushback. Now, it's likely that Poland would view that strike more harshly than the rest of NATO, and rightfully so. Depending on how much Russia is willing to gamble, they might be viewing a strike like this in a similar light to how Germany viewed the Schlieffen Plan leading up to World War One. In that historic scenario, Germany didn't want to take on France and Russia at the same time, so they came up with a plan, the Schlieffen Plan, to quickly knock France out of the war so they could turn their entire military to the east and take on Russia before they had a chance to mobilize. Of course, that's not exactly how things played out. So I think it's possible that at some point, Russia considers that such a strike could slow the aid shipments into Ukraine at the risk of pulling Poland into the war, but not all of NATO. With how important Western aid is to Ukraine, that might be a risk they're willing to take. But once one NATO country is actively engaged with Russia, it becomes even more clear how the entire alliance could slowly shift in that direction over the following weeks, months, and years. Before I get to the second scenario, this doesn't have anything to do with the video today. Just saw this picture circulating recently, wanted to put it up here. These are drones hung up in a bunker somewhere in Ukraine. Kind of creepy looking, like bats or something, doesn't it? I mean, I don't have a better way to store these, just thought it was an interesting picture. All right, back to the topic at hand. The second scenario has to do with the reaction to a Russian offensive in Ukraine. There's been a lot of talk recently, even from Ukrainian leadership, of a renewed Russian attack coming sometime in the next few months. Imagine one of these breaks through the Ukrainian lines in one or more places, and the front starts to collapse. With Ukrainian troops falling back and Russia quickly advancing, I could see a scenario where NATO steps in to protect the civilians that now find themselves in the path of the offensive. I'm not talking about the slow grind that's made up the bulk of this war, but a rapid overwhelming of certain Ukrainian defenses to where the entire country falling all of a sudden looks like a possibility. As this plays out, I could see panic starting in some of the Eastern European countries and quickly taking shape across NATO that this has to be stopped. How long will Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia watch this play out without pressing for new levels of intervention? And I don't think it would just be the eastern flank of NATO wanting to put a stop to this. There's a line I've heard repeated often recently that NATO is giving Ukraine just enough to not lose this war, but not enough to win it. In a very cold sense, I actually think that's pretty accurate. I mean, it's in NATO's interest for the Russian military to be ground down in Ukraine, and it's easy to have debates about what types of weapons should or shouldn't be sent when the lines are stagnant or Ukraine is even making progress in certain areas. But what happens when that momentum shifts and it looks like Ukraine could fall? There is a scenario where Ukraine doesn't just need equipment, but soldiers to do the fighting, and I'm guessing NATO would want to fill that gap before it's too late. In this war, a Russian victory isn't just a loss for Ukraine, it's a defeat for NATO. I mean, a stalemate, protracted conflict, or a Russian loss works for NATO, but not Ukraine being taken over. So maybe NATO draws a line at the Dnieper and sends in a rapid deployment force with air cover to facilitate the evacuation of civilians from the war zone. Maybe it's further west, I don't know, but I can see a scenario where something like that is put in place. And should that happen, will Russia just stop or continue pushing into the actual NATO troops on the ground? I mean, Russian leadership is regularly commenting about how they're already fighting NATO, so putting NATO troops on the ground in Ukraine just kind of supports the idea that's already there. I'm not confident they would just stop somewhere in Ukraine because NATO said so, and now you're opening the door to the first shots being fired in not a Ukraine-Russia war, but a NATO-Russia war. I haven't mentioned anything nuclear-related yet, and that's for two reasons. First, a Russian nuclear attack on a NATO country would almost certainly pull us directly into war, but I don't see any reason for Russia to carry that out today. There's a lot of other steps they could take before reaching that point. Second, I don't believe a Russian nuclear strike in Ukraine would actually pull NATO directly into the conflict. Just like the whole rest of this video, this is one man's opinion, so bear with me, but as horrible as a nuclear attack in Ukraine could be, there are already horrible things happening all across the country. It would certainly be a step up, unprecedented since World War II, but I could see the response being something more economic, global sanctioning, isolation of Russia on the world stage, more than kinetic strikes on Russian military locations. Could be wrong. I just don't think nuclear is necessarily the next step in this conflict. So that's it. Two possibilities that I think could draw NATO into an active fight with Russia. Agreed, there are a bunch of other ways that could happen as well, but these are the two that kind of keep coming back to mind for me. So again, total speculation on my part. let me know what you think. But that'll do it for now. We'll see y'all next time.